So you're saying that all life encountered so far can be tracked back to some type of single-celled common ancestor? Catet nodded. It is why most of us have similar biology. Of course, varying environments shape that life into something different each time, but the base is already there. Andrew finished scooping the last mouthful of food from his plate, leaning back as he chewed. He gave a thoughtful look before swallowing. Huh, I guess our theory about panspermia was correct. Catet cocked her head, inquiring silently. Andrew picked up his cup. It's basically a hypothesis we had where microscopic life is transferred by space debris, surviving the harsh vacuum of space before eventually crashing onto another planet, thus spreading the building blocks for life in some type of chain reaction. Catet nodded again. That sounds correct. Only I have no idea if you are also a product of this phenomena. Since humans are from a death world, I don't know. You might be different. Andrew listened, watching as Catet picked up one of the seeds from her full plate and unenthusiastically ate one. Andrew frowned. She chatted with him readily enough this morning, just like they always did, but she was not as vigorous as usual. She seemed withdrawn, tired. Everything all right? Andrew asked. Cadet absently poked at her plate with a talon. I'm fine, just bored, I suppose. Her crown feathers laid back halfway as she looked up. The continued snowfall has made collecting solar energy increasingly difficult. And with the thick cloud cover these past 3 days, I haven't been able to recharge the battery. I can't exactly test the circuit without some sort of current, Cadet complained. She sighed before mumbling. I'm starting to dislike this weather phenomena now. Why is there so much of it? Relieved that it was only boredom, Andrew gave a little chuckle. Yep. Looks pretty at first, but it piles up quick. At least you don't have to shovel it like I do. Shit's a pain in the ass, especially when it's the wet stuff. It feels like it's 10 times heavier. Catet shot him an annoyed look, grumbling. I would help if I could, you know. I know, I'm just teasing, he said as he raised his cup to his mouth, taking a sip. Wouldn't expect you to get your tail feathers wet anyway. Catet's feathers bristled as she slammed a talon on the table. Excuse me? Andrew smirked, pulling the cup away from his lips slightly. You're about as adverse to the cold as a cat is to water. She narrowed her eyes. I don't know what a cat is, but you imply something I don't like, and it's untrue. As if, he laughed, pointing a thumb at the entrance as he leaned forward. I bet you wouldn't take a single step out there unless I shoveled the entrance for you. Feathers sharp, Catet straightened her stance, wings raised in agitation. I'll prove it right now, then, she declared before hopping down off the table, walking over to stand in front of the entrance. Andrew followed right behind her, walking up to the door and sliding it to the side along the cave wall. Looking beyond the door revealed a shimmering landscape of white. She stood still, glancing up at Andrew, gauging his reaction. He was a few steps to the side, his arms crossed as he smirked, just waiting for her to take the first step. Catet grumbled, thinking he was much too amused by this, but she was determined to prove him wrong. Catet returned her focus to the piled snow outside the entrance. The fresh, pristine layer formed a blanket over the land. Its slopes and banks, which had been formed by the whipping winds against the cliff face, reminded her of the dunes of Shalea. Dunes which were made of ice instead of sand that continued to pile up layer by layer as the fluffy flakes lazily drifted down, some even sparkling as they caught the filtered light of the cloud cover. Catet couldn't help an internal shake of her head, still amazed by the sight despite her frustration with it. It was a frozen, dangerous world, yet beautiful all the same. Catet had found that with the freezing cold came a calming stillness, a quiet reverence as the snow covered every surface, every branch, almost like a dampening blanket on the world. It was tranquil, but also cold and deep. In the lowest parts, the snow just about reached her chest, and she hesitated, wondering how she was going to traverse such a thing. But she pushed those thoughts aside. She took a talon and brushed it along the snow ridge that had been blown up against the entrance. It gave away easily as clumps of snow tumbled down to the cave floor. Stealing her expression and setting her crown feathers at a determined angle, she prepared to take her first step, knowing full well that she would have to be leg-deep in it. However, just as she was about to plant her first talon in the snow, there was a swift sound of movement behind her. She had no time to react when she suddenly found herself up in the air, weightless for a brief moment as her wings flared out in an instinctual maneuver. Whoomp. Catet's talons had punched right through the top layer of the deep snowbank, her body buried all the way up to her neck and her wings outstretched high above her. The feathers along her wingtips left faint imprints in the snow. Eyes wide, she blinked a few times to get her bearings before shaking her head to remove some of the snow that had stuck to her beak. Her eyes immediately narrowed when she heard the familiar sound of faint laughter. Slowly turning her head around, she saw Andrew, bent over with an arm over his abdomen, and laughing so hard that almost no sound came out. Catet grumbled again, flicking her plume of feathers in agitation as she tried flapping her wings in an effort to remove herself from the snow. It is mostly useless, as she only managed to accomplish shoving some out of the way. "Andrew," she almost growled. He managed to glance up from his hunched position and meet her eyes, but it only served to put him in another fit of laughter. Catet wiggled in the snow, annoyed, but then an idea suddenly occurred to her. Twisting around as much as she could, she angled herself towards the human. A sharp glint sparkled in her eye as she stretched out her wings horizontally, digging them deep into the snow beside her, before swiftly bringing them forward in a rush. A wave of freezing, powdery snow crashed into Andrew, and he yelped, straightening involuntarily as some of it went down his neck. He frantically brought a hand up, wiping as much away as he could, even going so far as to billow his jacket to release the chunks that had slipped down his back. Catet laughed, crown feathers bobbing in delight. "Serves you right." When Andrew finished, his eyes were wide in surprise as he looked at her, as if not expecting her to retaliate. His expression turned suspiciously blank when he turned to face her. To Catet's confusion, Andrew reached down, grabbing a handful of snow, and proceeded to pack it with his bare hands into a little ball, all the while with a growing smirk on his face. He cocked his arm back. Catet's eyes widened in alarm, and she swiftly raised her wings in defense just before the lobbed snowball smacked into her feathers. It wasn't a hard throw by any means, but it certainly caused a puff of snow as the lightly packed ball dispersed into chunks. She heard Andrew bend down and scoop up another handful. She couldn't help but laugh when she braced for another impact, and then another. There was a pause, and she lowered her wing a fraction, daring to take a peek over her feathers. Too soon. Thud. "Andrew," she complained in good fun. He smiled. "You messed with the wrong human, Ket. I was a snowball-making champion back in 2182. Thud. "Oh man, this brings back memories." Catet hid beneath her feathered canopy, and during the attack, she had trouble getting any of her own moves in and was pinned beneath her wings, the relentless snowballs piling on top of her. When Catet was sure Andrew was finished, she popped her head up between the mound of snow on her wings, the snowflakes practically clinging to her feathers at this point. She was in a dazed state as she blinked. Andrew laughed again at her expression, but he finally relented his bombardment of snowballs, taking a couple snow-crunching steps towards her. "Had enough?" he smiled cheekily. Cadet playfully smacked him with the snow-covered wing. "I wouldn't call that a fair game." Andrew chuckled again, but ultimately decided to show mercy and help scoop a good chunk of the snowbank away, unburying her. She finally stood on her own two legs again, albeit with snow still practically past her ankles, but at least she could move again. Taking the opportunity, Catet flapped her wings vigorously to remove as much snow as she could. This also gave her the satisfaction of Andrew leaning back in surprise as snow flew everywhere, almost like a dog shaking off water after a swim. When she finished flapping, he shot her a look over a raised arm as if to say, "Really?" Catet fluttered her crown feathers, more than pleased with the result. Andrew shook his head helplessly, though with a small smile on his face, before taking a hand and brushing off the flakes from his jacket and hair. "I suppose I deserved that," he admitted. Catet nodded firmly once before laughing again. How strange. The snow was cold and the air was crisp as she remembered. Yet she was warmer than she had ever been. Who knew playing in the snow could be such fun, even if it was cold as ice? She chuckled to herself, feeling like a young fledgling, careless and free of the world's problems. However, despite the warmth she felt, there was still a slight chill that went up her back. Catet fiddled with her makeshift clothing for a moment, tugging at it to try and twist it back into place. Her movements in the snow had inevitably bunched it up. She heard Andrew shift on his feet, the snow crunching loudly under his boots. "Hey, listen," Andrew said, his voice low. Catet paused from her movements and looked up, still beaming but wondering at his softer tone. He looked down, clearing his throat. "I have a surprise for you, for the season." Catet cocked her head, confused. "What do you mean?" Andrew gave her a small smile, crouching down. "So, on Earth we have a special tradition. A holiday. During this time of year, at least where I used to live, when it began to snow, we would celebrate a thing called Christmas. I don't exactly know what day it is here relative to Earth, but I'd consider it good enough, especially with the snow and all." Catet listened quietly. Andrew rarely spoke of his home out of his own volition, so she made sure to listen to every word. She looked up curiously. A tradition? So it is something that runs in your family? He nodded. But not just mine. Many people in my country and even others around the world celebrate it. Near the shortest day of the year, families and friends get together and usually have a feast while sharing gifts and presents. For many people, it's an important and special time to gather with those important to you, to enjoy their company. Catet's feather plume lifted, intrigued. That sounds nice. What is it you celebrate exactly? Andrew brought his hand to his chin. It has some religious roots way back in our history, I believe, but nowadays it's mainly celebrated as a way to spend time with family during the harshest time of the year. It means something a little different to each person, but it's generally a favorite holiday among humans. He chuckled to himself. You know, it's a bit funny. As much as a lot of us love it, after a couple of years, Christmas becomes stressful in a way. He waved his hand in the air. People are busy and pushy in the stores. You have to listen to the same old Christmas jingles and music you've been hearing for the past couple of centuries. Even the hassle of decorating and setting up a tree in your house with lights and ornaments and all that bullshit becomes tiresome at some point. His smile turned wistful. But after missing a couple of them, I never realized how much it meant to me, you know? He scratched the back of his head, and Catet got the feeling he was embarrassed. Anyways, I made this for you. It's my Christmas gift for you. Stunned, Catet could only watch as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something very peculiar. He presented two identically shaped wooden objects, each one about the size of his hand. They were carefully carved into the shape of an oblong hoop with a small tail at the end, along with a pattern weaved out of some kind of twine in the middle, almost like some sort of racket. She also noticed a piece of sewn fabric that was attached by thick threads to 4 points along the outer edge of each hoop. These are called snowshoes. They will help you walk on top of the snow. Catet didn't know what to say at first, completely surprised. And it was a few long seconds before she looked up to meet Andrew's gaze. These are for me? He chuckled, nodding. They are. Catet blinked, her crown feathers automatically fanning out in delight. But then she hesitated, a look of concern in her eyes. I don't have anything to give in return. Andrew shook his head gently. You don't need to, Cat. They're a gift. Besides, the joy is in the giving. Her feathers fluffed happily as she lifted a careful wing to inspect the intricately carved pieces. Though she had never seen any type of footwear like this before, she could tell they were made with care. The carved edges were smooth, and the inner mesh was symmetrically and diligently woven. Then she noticed, quite suddenly, that the general shape started to look sort of familiar. She tittered at the thought. This whole time he hadn't been carving new tableware, but rather a set of snowshoes. She looked up at Andrew, returning her wing to her side before dipping her head down in thanks, the purple iridescence in her feather plume peeking through. He gave her a small smile in return. Why don't you give them a shot? I want to make sure they fit right, Andrew said before offering his arm to perch on. Cadet hopped up out of the snow without a second thought, eager to try them on. Being able to finally walk on the snow with confidence sounded like a blessing, and she couldn't be happier that Andrew had even thought of the idea. Andrew carried her back into the cave, and she jumped down to the workbench. He set the snowshoes down in front of her and proceeded to explain how they attached to her talons, all the while drifting off into tangents as he talked about his various ideas and experiments with the design. He had certainly put a lot of thought into it, and she was sincerely touched. He had offered a gift with no expectation of an exchange. Cadet looked up and watched quietly as Andrew rambled on about the design, his face practically alight with joy. He had one of those smiles again, the one that reached his eyes. She had to wonder, maybe this is what Christmas was all about. And when she finally had the snowshoes strapped on, with Andrew ushering her back outside in excitement, she couldn't help but let her crown feathers fan out, his expression infectious. She decided right then and there that she quite enjoyed the thought of this human holiday, and that despite their situation as two castaways on an unknown world, there was still a way to laugh, to smile, and to have fun. Cadet took another step out into the cold, but this time feeling much warmer than before as she stood atop the snow, her feathers fluffed in happiness. Hey everybody, thanks again for watching. All the things I used in the video are in the description below. If you have a story you'd like to see narrated, please let me know and I'll see if I can contact the author and we can make that happen. Thanks again, and remember to look up and seek the stars.